Hello, and welcome to our virtual roundtable, Approaching IND, What to Consider in Early Development. My name is Jennifer Tarian, Vice President of Marketing at Cambrex, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Before we get started, I'll cover a couple housekeeping notes. The webinar console is set up to display well on most monitors. If you're having trouble seeing a particular window or would like to resize it, click on a corner and drag it to your desired size or location. If you run into any issues, please try refreshing your browser first. If you need additional support, please let us know via the Ask Question window. We'll be holding a live question and answer session following this presentation. Feel free to submit questions throughout the discussion. We'll go through as many questions as possible during question and answer, and we'll follow up on any remaining questions after the event. I'd like to start the session today by introducing our panelists who have joined us for the discussion. First, Derek Coops, VP and General Manager at Cambrex in Longmont. Derek is an experienced CDMO executive with more than 25 years of experience in pharmaceutical product development. Derek comes from a project management background and has held leadership roles at industry-leading CDMOs at sites including capabilities focused on early development, oral solid dose, and biologics. James Graham is a research fellow for drug substance and process chemistry R&D. James has 25 years of experience in pharmaceutical discovery and development, focused entirely on early stage discovery through IND, as well as phase 1 and 2 development. He is a synthetic chemist by training and a subject matter expert in early phase development. His career has spanned the spectrum from academic to startup to small biotech and all the way to big pharma. Next, Jason Gregerson is the Director of Formulation R&D and Drug Product Operations at Cambrex. Jason has over 24 years of experience in pharmaceutical development. He is an expert in formulation and process development, drug product optimization and scale-up, technology transfers, project and change management, as well as quality assurance. He has assisted in numerous regulatory filings and overseen many lifecycle management programs. And last but not least, Tracy Milburn. She's our Director of Analytical Services at Cambrex. Tracy brings more than 25 years in analytical chemistry experience, ranging from early stage development through commercial product manufacturing. Her experience spans from drug substance through finished product analytical method development, as well as quality control in support of commercial manufacturing. She has supported IND, ANDA, NDA, and other regulatory submissions through the design of support studies, testing, or authoring of the relevant sections of support documentation. At this time, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of our presenters for joining us today. So now that you've learned about all of our presenters, I'll share a little bit about the folks in the audience. We have a range of drug developers who are at a variety of stages of development, from candidate selection to IND submission and beyond. As you heard in each of the panelists' introductions, they all work in Colorado at our Longmont facility, but have expertise in different areas that support preclinical development. We've prepared a few visuals to explain how our panelists work together. If you look in the bottom right corner of your screen, you'll find the slides for this segment of today's presentation. You can maximize that window if you would like to follow along. So Derek and team, can you give us a quick introduction to Longmont and your departments?
Yeah, thanks very much, JT. So Derek Coops here. So as a CDMO focusing on early development, we've gone through a lot of product development projects with our various customers supporting IND submissions. So really appreciate the chance to talk with you and the team here about some of the experiences we've had along the way. So for some of just by way of background, a little bit of information about the site where all three of us work. So we work for the Center of Excellence for Early Pharmaceutical Development at Cambrex Longmont. So this is a site of about 80,000 square feet with 115 employees. We focus exclusively on product development, so on projects that range from preclinical through phase 2A. And really what's unique about this site that we have in Longmont is that it represents kind of the true integration of drug substance and drug product development within one site. So in the same site, we've got both drug substance development and manufacturing, as well as pre-formulation capabilities, and then drug product development and manufacturing, as well as a full suite of analytical services to support the product development through that entire phase of product development. So really, having both of these capabilities together in one site, well, I guess all three of these capabilities together in one site, that really allows us to offer fast and flexible enablement of IND submissions in partnership with the sponsoring companies. So I think the other thing I really would like to point out here is the location. So we're located in the United States, and that really helps us on some logistical challenges for products in early development. So frequently what ends up happening is the early development API work and initial synthesis is done offshore. Material gets moved into the US to a drug product development and manufacturing site in order to come up with drug product. That information is used to support the IND submission, but then you end up with a conundrum because the API came into the US without having an IND, and then it can't be used directly in a clinical study and then used in the US without having come into the US under an IND. So that leads to a lot of logistical challenges which can be avoided by developing and manufacturing the API for that phase 1 study in the US. So we think we're uniquely situated to support customers as a result of our location and also the co-location of these services in one site. And just to kind of clarify who on the panel of our subject matter experts here does what within the site. So we have Jim, who's responsible for leading our process chemistry team. And then he will also speak to the drug substance manufacturing piece as well at the site. We have Jason Gregerson, who is responsible for pre-formulation through drug product manufacturing, including formulation development. And then throughout the pipeline in our site, Tracy Milburn's team provides comprehensive analytical services. So that gives you kind of an overview of our location and who does what.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. As we saw registrants come in for this webinar, we asked all of our attendees to suggest some topics that they would like us to cover, and we've worked those into the agenda today in some of our questions. The first was really related to identifying blind spots in the development strategy. So whether it's your first time moving through clinical development and IND submission, or your 10th, there always seem to be some challenges that pop up along the way. So Derek, I'd like to pass the first question over to you. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing clients struggle with as they work through getting their early development programs started?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that all the product development projects have in common is that each one is unique, and each molecule is going to present unique challenges to the sponsoring company preparing the IND, as well as any CDMO that's working on that molecule on behalf of the sponsor. Some of the unique challenges that we're seeing coming up now, I guess they aren't really unique because timeline has always been paramount in product development, where you want to get your product either to the next stage as quickly as possible, or if it is going to fail, you want it to fail early before investing a tremendous amount of effort into that project. So what we're really seeing, though, is that there's an exacerbation of that pressure on timeline with our sponsors as we come out of the pandemic for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is really the increased cost of capital as a result of the cost of borrowing having gone up. We're seeing our customers more focused on trying to move forward as quickly as possible, fewer, more key to their company assets to get it to the next phase of development. And the other thing that we're really seeing is the supply chain challenges coming out of the pandemic are leading our customers to be forced to book farther ahead of time slots, as an example, with the sites that are performing the toxicology studies. So because the studies are harder to book at the tox locations, our sponsors are often booking those slots even before they come to us and secure the work with us. And when the project starts at our site, we've already got a hard date booked for when that tox study is taking place, and a firm commitment that GLP material needs to be provided to that tox study to that tox site for the study. And then the other impact there is really because of the challenges getting that slot booked, there's a bigger impact to our customers if that slot is missed, because there's going to be a bigger delay for them to get back in if they miss their time. So really not new to product development that there's the focus on timeline, but we're finding that it's become more and more critical to successful product development than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Now, I'd like to direct that same question over to the rest of our panelists. James, from a drug substance perspective, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so when a project first enters into development, my group is usually the first one to see it. Process chemistry is usually your first onboarding project team that you interact with. And, you know, I'll just have to double down on what Derek said about the timelines being hyper constricted more these days than ever before. And I think it's important to understand that at this very early stage, we are learning new things about your compounds every single day. And that leads us to a situation where we are finding ourselves in a take one step forward, one step back situation. And all of these kind of new learnings and experiments that take place early on is something that we have to expect and anticipate going into this first part. The science never goes perfectly without any setbacks or hiccups. And this is really where you're learning about your compound for the first time. So in my group, you know, of course, we're looking at the synthetic process of this and how to transform a medicinal chemistry synthetic route into a fully scalable manufacturing process. And we try to do it in a way that helps the client deliver on time under their current constricted timelines. And all of this definitely takes some time and some patience and some understanding that there is a one step forward, one step back until we reach that point of success and set the table for the other downstream groups to have success.
Yeah, thanks, James. Speaking of other downstream groups, Jason, why don't I pass it to you?
Yeah, to add on to that, you know, some of the bigger challenges that we have, you know, coming from, you know, for us, we get the drug substance. A lot of the challenges we have is the quantity of drug substance that we get from either from our drug substance site or from our you know, clients. They send us the drug substance. So, you know, the quantity is really low. We're really flexible. We try and meet the needs so we don't overuse it. Being flexible is what it's about. A lot of times is as the project continues on, it continues to you know, it continues to evolve. And like Jim said earlier, you know, we're always learning about it. For you, a lot of times is you're learning what dosage form, what dosage strength you want. And so it's really hard to understand, you know, to make a solid thing. So we're really flexible. We understand those challenges, and from a timeline standpoint, we try and be as flexible as we can.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Tracy, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, I'm not emphasize any more than Jason and Jim already have, but I think one of the challenges that is sometimes missed or overlooked because they think the work is already done. The analytical has to keep up with all of those process changes, both on the process chemistry side as well as on the product development side. And I think there is a tendency to think that once the analytical is done, it's done. And there are frequently we're chasing the process most of the time because every change, the methods need to be revetted. We need to make sure that they're scientifically sound for any kind of changes or dose increases or decreases. So I think that's one of the challenges that people often kind of neglect to include in their timeline, is that any change in the process or any change in the manufacture of the materials will cause a delay. And I think that there's often a little bit of a miscommunication or a misalignment on timelines because of that. You can't keep the original timeline if you're changing the process. And I think that sometimes that's one of the bigger challenges that we see, is that clinical data is set. And so there's not, you know, a lot of leeway to mess around with changes and stuff. And yet sometimes the process needs it. So being cognizant of that and making sure that you're accounting in your original plan to expect issues, I think is something that is a bigger challenge in early stage development than it is anywhere else, because when you're set and you have to go, you have to go. So one of my biggest pieces of advice for the clients is to make sure that you're accounting for things to go wrong through your process, because it never works perfectly.
Yeah, I think those are some excellent blind spots and good advice there for our audience. I was listening to each of your responses, and the words phase appropriate came to mind, especially when you were talking about timeline, cost, and risk. So, as you're working with clients in each of your areas, what are some ways that you collaborate to determine what will be phase appropriate for each individual client's programs? And James, I'd love to direct this one to you first.
Yeah, sure. I think each of our groups have sort of different aspects of what's phase appropriate, but starting certainly with the synthetic and manufacturing component of your drug substance, that's where it all starts. And there, as we move through process chemistry, we're really designing a manufacturing process that is fit for purpose and phase appropriate. Meaning, if you're going into filing an IND or your first phase 1 studies, there is usually a smaller amount that's required for the deliverable. Of course, that varies by compound, but we're definitely not supporting, phase 2, extended phase 2 efficacy studies. And so the process and the timelines being what they are, we often have to develop a process that can deliver those quantities under GMP conditions in the sufficient quantity and specs that are determined by the client, but do that in a way that just meets what we need. We can't fully optimize the process very early on when you don't even know whether or not the compound will continue through development. So it's often phase appropriate just to get a manufacturing process that gets you what you need under the quality systems that you need it to meet the demand at this time. And then you'll always have to circle back. There'll be more process chemistry that has optimizations that have to take place as you move through development. And it's okay to not have all the answers right up front. There are certain answers you have to have, and focusing on those allows you to meet your timelines and get your deliverables on time and perform whatever studies you have scheduled. So it's important to keep a phase-appropriate sort of mentality about how you're moving through this very initial early-stage development process.
All right, let's continue to elaborate on that. Jason, from a drug product perspective, what resonates as phase-appropriate for you?
For us, it's really, kind of comes down to what dosage form you want. Do you want just powder in a capsule? Do you want a fully formulated product to go into your phase 1, phase 2 trials? A lot of times it just ends up, you want to get there faster. So to come up with a fully optimized formula, whether it's a capsule or a tablet, isn't necessarily, needed. We like James said, a lot of times you can do that in the background as you first, get your first GMP batch going in your clinics. We can always optimize as that stuff's going through. But really, for the first phase, phase 1, and even some of those phase 2, you do not have to. Our experience is you don't have to have a fully optimized process. A lot of times for us, for our clients, we're just hand filling capsules, especially for the phase 1, smaller equipment. It doesn't necessarily need to. Knowing that in the future, we can add other stuff to the process to make it more optimized, other excipients and stuff like that. But really, early on, and then phase 1, phase 2, you don't necessarily need to have a fully formulated, optimized process. But we can. We do that. Some clients want a more in-depth formula for their process going into that, so they don't have to change later on. But what we're finding out is you want to get in to make sure your clinic it's going to work. So we're very flexible, and it also comes down to sizes. A lot of times we're making batch sizes just enough to get it into a clinic and to put it on your stability program. So our batch sizes might only be 10,000 units. We can, but as it progresses, we can always scale up and do larger batch sizes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Tracy, how about you?
Yeah, I think phase appropriate is an interesting topic. I think it's a blessing and a curse. A lot of times I think people want that perfect submission for their IND, and the reality is there is no perfect submission. As Jim and Jason have both said, there are changes that are going to happen throughout the process, and it's hard to anticipate those. So phase appropriateness on the analytical side is often a double-edged sword, because you want to be as complete as you possibly can, but also, these methods are in their infancy. They haven't been vetted over a stability program. We haven't seen them in operation for very much more than the course of development. So things will change, and trying to decide what your regulatory strategy is and what your quality strategy is going into that regulatory filing are kind of, it's a difficult bag, right? We get people from, the bare minimum, we just need to fill out the sections in the IND to move forward, to people who are trying to get like the perfect IND filed. And I would caution against that perfect IND, because every time you move the process, every time you increase the size, every time you change a solvent even, you're going to have to look at everything all over again. So it's a balance between what do you need for now and what do you need for going forward, and making sure that you're, especially if you're working with the CDMO, making sure that everybody is in alignment with that strategy. So it's a nice space, because you have some flexibility in how you're treating your methods in your program. It's a rough space though, because the timelines are so small, and everybody doesn't want to have to go back and repeat what they've done in early phase. But kind of the reality is that you're going to, you've got method development that has to happen, method validations, continuing development throughout all phases of your program until you get to that commercial phase. So it's early phases is both a very great space to be in and also a tough space to be in, because you have to make sure that your strategy aligns with your business, and as well as whoever's manufacturing your materials. Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Derek, is there anything that you would add? I know our panelists covered a lot there, but I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I guess a lot of my background's been working on product development projects in combined early development, late development, and commercial facilities, and often the most stringent of quality systems are applied then across the site, and then that makes it more difficult to be fast and flexible on the early phase projects. So things that are perfectly acceptable in early development, like working with qualified rather than validated analytical methods, or by merely doing ID testing on incoming raw materials that are excipients. Those are things that at a dedicated early development facility that are perfectly acceptable from quality standards, that might be more of a challenge in some of the combined facilities where I've worked in the past. So I think just really it's working within that gray of the early development in terms of what is required, and then making sure that the quality systems are being adhered to, and that we're following all of the rules, but that we're not applying later phase quality standards on early phase development work.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I think that we've talked a lot about challenges here, and I do know that there are many challenges that come up, and I'm glad that we talked through them. But I'd love to pivot our conversation here and start talking about some of the solutions that the team on the phone here has come up with in the past. So, Tracy, Jason, and James, they've been collaborating together in Longmont for the past 4 years on various client projects. And we'd just love for you guys to go through some examples of how you've helped our clients once they've run into these challenges. How have you helped keep these projects moving? And James, I think that you have one that you wanted to share to start us off, right?
Yeah, I think that there are certainly examples, plentiful examples, because at this stage there are always challenges that pop up, and it's how nimble can you be and how creative and flexible can you be to address those challenges in a timely fashion for your clients. And I think one of the things that really enables us, particularly at this site, to do, and something that I think a viewer should be aware of as they're moving their projects through development, is these are common issues that are going to pop up no matter where you go, and it's how do you manage those problems, especially if you're dealing with multiple vendors as opposed to possibly a single vendor that can handle multiple aspects of your development program. One such example was as we were moving a project through the process chemistry optimization and preparing for GMP production of drug substance. On the final step in the demonstration batch, we identified completely unknown and never before seen polymorph for a project. And that was a little bit of a setback because we weren't expecting that, and we were expecting a different polymorphic form. And so that sent us into a little bit of a scurry to identify that polymorph and characterize it. And fortunately, having Jason's group on site just down the hall to Jason's group and pre-formulation and material characterization, and Tracy's group in analytical to help us fully characterize and identify the polymorphic form, allowed us all to be on the same page very quickly within days, and bring that material back into the process chemistry labs to develop a process for either making the original polymorphic form or developing a stable and reliable method for manufacturing the new, more stable polymorphic form. And that really saves weeks and weeks, literally weeks of time in transit between groups and conversations between groups, and all of that happened within days. And so having an organization or a site that can perform the multiple developmental functions, such as drug product, drug substance, analytical on site, really puts us in a position where everything we do here is designed for this early phase work. All of our instrumentation, all of our systems, everything is optimized for addressing all these common problems that pop up so that we can pivot in an instant to start working on those problems. And I think that that's a big benefit. And that's just one of many examples that our clients and certainly the people on the line will certainly experience as they develop their compound.
Thanks, James. Jason, do you have a project that you'd like to share?
Yeah, to add on to some of the stuff that we've all been talking about, a lot about challenges, and I would say that at our site we're really good at problem solving. Not every project is simple. You run into obstacles and stuff. So one project that we've had, it didn't necessarily start in our drug substance area, but it came over. We end up at the end of our GMP batch, we had some dissolution issues. We typically at our site will do a small scale pilot first and then go into our GMP batch. And a lot of times is with clients, you don't have that GMP material till the very end. So, we're doing the pilot stuff and everything can look really good using pilot non-GMP material. So everything looked good. We went into our GMP batch, and next thing you know, we have dissolution problems. We go back and because of the timelines, and as with most projects, the timelines are crunched. So, you take a risk-based approach as to what all needs to be done up front. And, we go back and kind of understand what's the difference here. And what ended up being was more of a particle size issue. Everything looked good with the drug substance, but the pilot batch, which is the pilot batch for the drug substance, was made at smaller scale. So they had to really fine, end up being more micronized material than what the GMP material was. Because we have everything at the site, we even had, we can change that particle size. We have on-site micronization, so we were able to incorporate within 2 or 3 weeks, understand the issue, and we were able to do it in our formulation lab, kind of reproduce it, take the drug substance from the GMP batch, micronize it, and the dissolution looks good. And then we're also able to scale that up to our larger into our GMP manufacturing area. And so we're able to be flexible. We're able to turn. We were able to solve the problem. And, within a month, we had to repeat a GMP batch for a client. So, with Tracy's group, they had development, the analytical testing right here on site, with drug substance, being able to help characterize that, and our material characterization lab, we were able to turn it around fairly quickly and, end up meeting our clients' needs and hitting their timeline.
That's excellent. While we're talking about Tracy and her group, I think Tracy is kind of the backbone for both of these guys on the phone. And so, Tracy, what other projects do you think would be helpful to share?
Yeah, so analytical, I'm sure everyone online is more than aware that analytical is always the cause of the failure. So whenever there's an issue, we're usually the one to find it, right? It's usually a surprise, and it usually is something that's coming out of analytical. And both of the issues that Jim and Jason have spoken about were discovered in the lab, unfortunately. Also lucky enough to be able to address both of them through working with the groups here at the site. in addition to those things, things that consider our scale-up issues. We have had, we had a client here just recently that had an issue with, of all things, the ROI content of their material. Typically, residue on ignition is usually less than 2%. It's something that is not something that you need to worry about really ever in your project. All through the research, the PR&D development of this material, that value was under 2. It looked good. Everything was great. We get into the GMP manufacturing and go to release the material. It's 10%. So 10% is a crazy number. It'll make your assay fail. It'll make your impurities fail. It's not, not the most fun to deal with. But we're fortunate because we have the ability here on site. We have the ability to do the metals testing. We have the ability to do in-depth impurity profile screening via mass spec to be able to pinpoint why that value was coming out so high, where the material was coming from. Turns out it's a wash step in the process. Take it back one step, honestly do a water wash with it and it'll wash that salt away. But the ability for us to get that identified within a week, harvest the material from the residue on ignition testing, get it into our material characterization lab, get the testing done to identify what compound it was so we could identify the source, and then give that information back to the process chemistry team to be able to take a look at the process and see what they could do to clean it up. All within a week is something that we're very fortunate to have those tools here on site and to be able to deal with those problems almost as they're happening, and not have to wait and rely on outside testing to get stuff done, essentially. So I think, it's really cool. I've never worked in an organization where we had everything, basically at our fingertips. There's not much we can't solve if we hit the problem. And the teams do work really well together. So if I need to pull in Jason's team for any kind of characterization work, the material characterization group for metals testing, get that to Jim's team to see what they can do to clean it up. It's beyond great for the analytical team to have those resources to be able to help us solve the problem, because often you're working, you got the single problem and you aren't able to walk down the hallway and say, hey, this is happening. What can we do for this? So those kind of issues are kind of fun to work with. Not fun for the client, but it's kind of cool. It's a learning experience for everybody, and it gives everybody kind of moving forward things to look out for as we're doing different development projects.
As each of you talked about those solutions and the way that you solve the problems, it comes across as really easy. And Tracy, you touched on being able to walk down the hallway and just use your resources there and your colleagues to problem solve. And so my last question that I have before we go into the question and answer segment is, when working under one roof, I'm sure there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that our customers don't see. And so Derek, from an operational perspective, what's it like behind the scenes of a one-stop shop?
Yeah, I think a lot of the examples that were provided by Jim, Jason, and Tracy kind of illustrated what we're able to do. And I think it really comes down to the one common thing that all product development projects have in common is that they all have problems, and that all of those problems and challenges that you come up in development are different. So each product development project is going to provide its own unique and surprising curveball that needs to be addressed within product development. And for us, having the ability to go as far back as process chemistry when we discover something in GMP drug product manufacturing really gives us the ability to quickly respond to unexpected problems. So I'm thinking of a situation where all of a sudden on stability, when you've got your accelerated conditions, you come up with a novel impurity that's detected in the drug product. Because we are also a drug substance site, we've got all of the characterization equipment on site to be able to figure out what the structure is of that novel impurity. So we've got LCM, SMS, NMR, XRPD. We can go in and really identify what that new impurity is. And because we've also got synthetic chemists on site, we can create, synthesize some reference standard for that material and then qualify it and then incorporate that into our assays in order to measure the growth of that novel impurity as the stability program progresses. So there's really gives us a lot of flexibility between the groups to go back and forth up and down the process of both the API and drug product development and manufacturing. And I think the additional thing really, where you end up losing time in product development is in some of the logistical steps and handoffs. So Jason gave an example of where we needed to go back and micronize an API, and that only was discovered at the time we went to make our GMP drug product. So if we were at a traditional drug product development site that didn't have micronization, you'd be looking at, bundling that material up, shipping it off, fitting it into the schedule at the micronization shop, shipping it back to our site, then re-receiving it as a new raw material, releasing that, and then getting back into production. Whereas for us, we were able to just incorporate that as a step in the batch record and take care of it that way. We also, because we're all one team going back and forth through the development pathway, we don't consider the drug product manufacturing as a completely separate step. So I'm thinking in the past where I was responsible for an early development site that did drug product development and manufacturing, if we were a couple of weeks out from manufacturing and we hadn't yet received the API, we would pull projects out of the schedule and then fit them back in when we could, if we didn't have great confidence that the API would be there in a day or two. Whereas here, if Jason starts getting worried about his schedule and the drug product side and whether or not the API is available, he can really get a good sense of confidence from the drug substance team that the API is going to be there, and he'll hold it in the schedule knowing that he's planning on starting on Thursday, but by Monday end of day we should have the last API step done. So it really allows us to kind of respond to changes in the drug substance schedule and have them not impact our drug product schedule. So yeah, I think that's some of the advantages we see with working together under one roof.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the rest of our presenters today. What are the behind the scenes things that our clients don't see? Jason, I think you had something.
Yeah, I think a lot of times you don't see the communication. When we're working with projects, especially with within our own teams and stuff, we're communicating all the time. We're also on the same page with the clients. Communication with the clients is critical. So when issues arrive, we'll talk internally, but then we try and get the client informed as soon as possible, whether it's good or bad. Everybody wants good data, so you always want that, but what we feel is it's important to keep you guys up to date. And from a communication standpoint, we run it by each other. Hey, what's the next stage? What do we think? And we'll pass that on to the client as soon as we can and do.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. James or Tracy, anything you'd add?
No, I would just reiterate a little bit of what Jason said. Often, when an issue comes up, I don't think anybody wants to just be presented with the issue. Everybody wants to be presented with an issue and a potential solution. So, when we hit something in the lab that is a problem, my first stop really before I talk to anyone else is either to talk to the process chemistry team or to talk to the formulations group, so that we can start brainstorming on what a solution to the problem is before we talk to the client. And I think that it's a mixed bag for the client sometimes, because it sometimes feels like a delay, but we don't ever want to come to the client and without at least a start on a solution to the problem. And I think a lot of that you don't get a feel for that when you're on the other end of that phone call or that conference call.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I would just tack on to that just slightly and build off of what Derek had mentioned and try to. For me, as I'm listening to each of us talk, and it really brings back home the original sort of premise that timelines are compressed, and that's what we're seeing. All of our clients feel that pressure. They really need to get their material on time, and they have less and less time every single year, and that is overwhelmingly the primary pressure point for our clients. And these types of little hiccups that happen along the way, the things that we learn about the compound and the development of the compound all the way through drug product, these happen everywhere, and it's the nature of very early stage development. And the ability to, I think what our audience should take from this is that if you're not aware of all the different challenges that do kind of pop up, the one step forward, one step back, two steps forward, one step back sort of situation that happens at this early stage, now you can begin to appreciate that and understand where you can be losing some time in the handoff between groups. As one group experiences a challenge and needs to go back to another group to help support that back and forth, that has an impact on your overall timeline. And I think that what's been fortunate for us and something that those on the call should be aware of, and certainly our clients are aware of, is where you can save time, where you can save time by just waiting, by just having conversations. And that's what you should be looking for. If time really is your enemy, then you need to find everywhere you can save unproductive time. And that's often in the margins and in the handoffs between groups. And so that's something that I think everyone should just be aware of, so that you can be cognizant and prepare for that. If that is your approach, have that preparation in hand.
I love that, James. Great closing words there to conclude our original program here. And I'm glancing down at the question list, and I feel like I don't even need to let everyone know in the audience, but we are now going to move on to the question and answer segment. If you have anything that's come to mind throughout the presentation, please go and enter that question into the Ask Question box, and it will come up in our queue here. I'm actually not going to pause to wait because we have a great set of questions here. So to get started, here comes our first question. With the hard timelines in early stage, how do you balance delivering API with process development activities? With more emphasis on quality by design, there's also an increased need for substantial data early on. Let me open that up to our panelists.
I would say that there is some added pressure with quality by design sort of pressures. However, it hasn't really changed a lot of the regulatory filing requirements. And I would say, and I'd pass this off to Tracy and Jason as well, but as I look back, our most successful clients who have gotten to where they want to be, the most successful ones are the ones who have been able to keep an eye on that phase appropriateness, that ability to get what they need when they need it, and address other issues that are more appropriate for later stage development. Address those at those times. Those clients who can do that the most effectively, those are the ones who move through the process and handle the challenges and the little hiccups that happen along the way. They handle that the best, and they're able to actually get where they need to be on time. The ones who fall far short of the mark, and I'm generalizing here, so maybe Tracy jump in here and check me, but the ones that fall way short are the ones who are always trying to answer every single question. Everything that comes up, they want to have an answer for. And of course, we're prepared and able to provide an answer, but that takes time and research and dedication to come up with those answers. And that takes away from your project, from your timeline, and puts your whole product at risk. So I would say just keep in mind the phase appropriateness of everything that you do, and try to get to the end point.
Yeah, I agree with
anything.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's the balance between knowing what's enough to move forward and making sure that you have the information that you need. Characterization of your material is an extremely important item. You're going to do that every step along the way. It is really a very, very important thing to know what your regulatory strategy is to file. And trying to make that perfect submission from the very initial filing will trip you 100 times along the way. You want to know your product, you want to know what direction you're going, but knowing every exact detail of everything along the way in a phase 1 operation, this isn't the time for that. That's more towards your later phase 3 commercialization, where you need to have all that information. So really kind of understanding what is enough to file is super important to keeping your program on track.
I think your regulatory strategy is a living strategy. The regulatory process is a living process, and it's going to continually change. You're going to have to continually adapt, change your filings, add information to it, change things that maybe you had filed early on. And this is something I think Tracy always points out to me is if you get too detailed early on, you may find yourself hurting yourself later by having to go back and change things that you were way too stringent on or way too specific about very early on, when we really don't know an awful lot about the compound or the process just yet. Not everything is optimized. And so that can lead to a lot of changes later on that will affect your timelines and your overall strategy. So many times less is more. And I think that that's not always a welcome sort of concept these days, as everybody seems to be wanting more and more and more, but oftentimes less can be more and can get you there faster and then give you the flexibility to make the changes that you need to make later on.
Right, and just to add on a little bit to that, I think some of what Jim alludes to is, setting of your specifications. At this phase, we have a variety of strategies for this. A lot of people try to go in with what they think they're going to go into their commercial process with. And in reality, you want to set those specs as wide as you possibly can at this phase. Go in wide, because you know the agency is going to, there will be comments and there will be requests for your specifications. So go in as wide as you can, because it's so much easier to narrow those specs than it is to widen them later. We do get caught quite often with an ideal specification that trips us up, either in the release or on stability. And you're still, at this point, you're still characterizing your material. Still probably getting some tox information. We're still discovering impurities. So going in with a super narrow spec sometimes can tie your hands with your process. So just things to be aware as you're building your submission is you can always go narrower. You can rarely go wider.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our next question. Our next question, they would like to hear a bit more about the onshore versus offshore synthesis issue. If I understand correctly, if you have your API synthesized offshore, it can't be used in a clinical trial unless you had an IND in place before the API synthesis and import. Is this restriction also applicable for starting materials, including GMP materials that are sourced offshore? Derek, why don't I pass this over to you to start, and you take it from there.
Yes. So that does create a bit of a conundrum when the API is, when GMP API is synthesized offshore, because if the drug product development and manufacturing is done in the US, typically the drug product data is used to support the IND submission, and then you end up with a conundrum. If the API came into the US without having an IND, you can't directly use it in a clinical study. So obviously making the API in the US gets around that quite easily. There are some other approaches with import for export, but it is circumvented by making the API in the US as well. I think this question, so certainly like raw materials going into the drug product, I mean, they don't need INDs, so they're not impacted by this. But I think the question is more relating to synthetic materials used to synthesize the API. How many steps back in the synthesis do you need to go with starting materials where it's acceptable to bring them in from offshore? And that's a little bit beyond my expertise, and probably would be, I don't know, Jim, if you can comment on an API that we're manufacturing, how many steps back from the final synthetic step the raw materials could come from offshore and not impact on the IND process?
I'll pass that to Tracy. She always has the best answer on this, and I tend to stutter when I talk about import-export things.
I would say on the process chemistry side, we don't see that issue quite as commonly with starting materials. Starting materials are very frequently sourced from outside of the US. The bigger issue that we see with starting materials coming in is really customs. So knowing ahead of time what you need to order and how much you need to order, we will source materials for you, but if you already have a supplier in mind and you know that material, where that material comes from, it's a good idea to get that process started early, because again, we're talking timelines, right? And if the lead time on getting a material into the country is 3 months, you've already blown your timeline. So from an import-export restriction, starting materials are not such an issue, but they are really from a supply chain and ability to get through customs can be kind of an issue.
Thanks, Tracy. All right, moving on to our next question. Tracy's comments earlier highlight for me the need for solid project management skills and competencies. From a staff development standpoint, what steps are being taken to ensure junior folks are being properly prepared? Do you include or expect formal PM training? I think, Derek, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, thank you, JT. So definitely communication is paramount. Like, we want to be considered an arm or an extension of the sponsor company's their own team with seamless communication back and forth, and our project management staff is critical for providing that. So that really comes from a combination of things. We do typically have our PMs go through PMP certification. That is normal as part of the on-the-job work. It isn't a prerequisite for starting. So it is critical that our project managers have a scientific background so that they can understand the discussion back and forth and really facilitate that communication. But a lot of their learning is on the job, working with the project teams, supplemented by more formal training, such as a PMP certification as they go through their career as project managers.
Thanks, Derek. All right, I'm going to keep moving through these questions. I have a feeling we're not going to get all of these, just so that the audience is aware. Like I said, we will follow up afterwards. All right, our next question, Tracy, I'd like to send this one over to you. By what stage after IND submission should a company start to worry or implement validated methods?
Yep, so kind of there, it's going to come back to your regulatory strategy again. A lot of companies will start to look at validation at later stage phase 2. Definitely phase 3 and commercial, you're going to need that validation work done. So it really kind of depends on how. So a lot of times people will produce enough clinical supply to bridge phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So throughout that life cycle, you're going to want to look at your methods over as it's going through the phases. But definitely at phase 3, you need to start worrying about your validated methods.
All right, thank you. Our next question, in early clinical stage phase 1, is it important to develop a formulation to increase the dissolution or bioavailability of a poorly soluble API?
Yeah, Jason, I can take that. It is, and it kind of depends on what kind of release you want. If you're looking for an immediate release, absolutely, you want to use as little much API and get it absorbed into the body as quick as possible. So yes, I mean, earlier on, when we're taking a drug substance, we'll test that in different pHs and see where that solubility of that drug is. And depending on where that is, whether it's in we'll just, like I said, we'll just do drug substance in a dissolution bath. And from then, we focus the formulation on around that. We'll add excipients to it to help enhance that solubilization of the drug. And we can also we have the capability at our site to do spray drying. We'll work on spray dry, try to make it more soluble, and also making it a tablet or capsule. We can add other excipients to help solubilize that active. Whether it's adding excipients, like I said before, we can micronize it, and we also have the capability at a small scale to do some spray dry dispersion stuff.
Thanks, Jason. All right, moving on to our next question. Is the production of one GMP batch to cover both GLP tox and phase 1 clinical trials still the common approach in early development? How about a less pure non-GMP batch for GLP tox and a GMP batch for phase 1? Is this more cost efficient?
Yeah, JT, I can take that one, or at least get started on it. This is really a strategic decision made by the client and what they think fits best for their program and their timeline. We do have clients that prefer to do a single GMP batch and carve out a portion of that for their their tox studies. But I would say what we're seeing more commonly is for a non-GMP batch be dedicated for what they're calling the GLP tox lot. And that affords them the opportunity to, as the question states, a less pure or a dirtier batch for that tox lot. And that speaks then to Tracy's comment about having broader specifications, particularly for your tox lot, so you have greater coverage, and allows the client to really have that flexibility. Then it also affords the development of the compound further, so that the GMP process is even more refined, and often you often get more pure compound out of the GMP batch, and which could be less desirable for your tox lot. So in a perfect world where everything is understood and highly developed, you could go right into GMP and perhaps save some time. But at this very early stage, we find that is rarely the case. There's always enough hiccups and challenges along the way that we're not saving much time, if we're not really saving any time by doing that. And so we do see it's very common to run a non-GMP batch for your tox lot. Tracy, you want to comment on the specification analytical implications of this strategy?
No, you're spot on. I think that tox lot is real important, that you go in with a fairly hefty impurity profile, because that will speak to your GMP spec later. What do you have qualified in that tox lot? Even if you have a cleaner process and you don't expect to see those impurities at that level, if you take those into tox and you see something on your accelerator program, or something hits instability that is above the level that you expected, and you have the tox data to cover it, it's much, much easier to keep the program alive than it is to try to go back at that time and respond to that impurity. From a cost-effective standpoint, it probably is not more cost-effective to make two different lots, but from a strategic filing and an ability to have all the data and information you need, I think it's important to have the two separate lots. It gives you experience with the process, and it also gives you a larger data set to develop your specifications from.
All right, we have time for one more question before we close up for the morning. And that question is going to go to you, Tracy. You mentioned a broad specification in early stage, such as phase 1. How broad of a specification can it be?
Depending on what you're looking at, fairly broad. And again, this is going to go back to your tox lot. So if you have impurities in your tox lot that are at 0.3%, and you didn't have issues on that study, you can set your spec, which is not the ICH limit for impurities. You can set your spec higher because you already have that data in hand. Total impurities is also something that you can set fairly high at this point. The agency will expect you to narrow that as you move through your program, but this is your opportunity to set them high, get your material out there, see if it's efficacious, see what you can do. I see a lot of people are trying to set their ROIs at like less than 1%, and I think that's kind of a risky business as well, especially with materials that are salt forms. Scale up has its issues, and so going into that and not understanding what that's going to do to your final product is a bit of an unknown. So the wider you can go in and still maintain a safety factor, the better off you are. It's your solvents are not something you're going to set wide. You're going to set those based on an ICH limit. It's really the other things around appearance. People tie their hands with appearance a lot of times. At this phase, you can go in with a report result and get some characterization data on that, because again, the scale of the process may change the color of the material. It may be kind of a white to kind of tan at a smaller scale, but it might be bright white when you scale up because it's just a cleaner process. So keeping those things wide as you're moving through the process, and knowing that you're going to have to narrow them as you get to your phase 3 and your commercial phase, will help you a lot. It'll save you a lot of time and effort and heartache.
Thanks, Tracy. All right, at this point, I would like to thank all of our presenters for joining us today and sharing your expertise. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us this morning. Thank you for spending 60 minutes with us out of your day. I know that there are a few questions that we did not get to. We will follow up with those one-on-one. We'll coordinate with the presenters so that we can get those over to you also in the next day or so. And with that, I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you again for joining.
Thanks.